Welcome to our webinar. I am Christine Tanner, Senior Marketing and Communication Manager at CSI. I will be moderating today's webinar session. Today's program, titled Introduction to the NCS version 6, will be presented by a panel of expert speakers who will be introduced as we go along. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation is available in the Standards section of the CSI website at www.csiresources.org. To start off today's presentation with an overview of the NCS version 6 is Ed Lowe. Ed is a CAD coordinator with Burgess & Nyepel Incorporated, a multidiscipline engineering and architectural firm in Plainsville, Ohio. Ed has more than 30 years experience in the production of construction drawings, including extensive use and support of AutoCAD and MicroStation. As CAD coordinator, Ed oversees CAD production for a wide variety of projects. His responsibilities also include class instruction, standards development, enterprise-wide installation, and CAD BIM-related IT support. He is a contributing writer to some of our leading industry publications. Ed serves as the chair of the United States National CAD Standard Project Committee and Steering Committee, and is a member of the National BIM Standard United States Project Committee. I will now turn the time over to Ed.
Okay. My job is to give you a little history and an overview of what is in the National CAD Standard. The history part of any topic is boring, so let's say that the NCS has been around a while and we have a solid foundation to build from. What's in the National CAD Standard? Everything you need to assemble a concise set of electronic documents. Years ago, everyone had an office drafting standard. It outlined everything needed for draftsmen to put out a consistent set of plans. To maintain quality and ease of construction, it was important that all the information provided on a set of drawings would easily be found and understood. In today's electronic age, drafting standards have been replaced by a CAD BIM standard. It is much easier to allow your computer to aid you in developing a consistent office standard. But the NCS has taken this thought one step further. If everyone were to use the same standard, then construction people would not need to relearn new symbols for every job. They would not need to decipher the file naming code from job to job where details, plans, and sections have been located. This would cut down on errors and time wasted searching large plan sets for information. Productivity would rise, ultimately saving money. So a whole lot of well-meaning people got together in 1999 and came up with the United States National CAD Standard. They included layer standards, symbology from established industry institutions, line styles, abbreviations, everything that makes up a set of plans for construction. And over the years, through an established consensus process, we've improved upon the standard through each of the published versions. Let's look at some of the elements of the standard and see what is in there. The layering standard. The AIA contributed the CAD layer guidelines to the NCS. It has been expanded over many years through the NCS consensus process. We now have a vast number of discipline codes, major and minor codes, to cover a wide assortment of different use cases. We can create layers or levels for everything from architectural walls, doors, and windows to civil bridges, roads, airport runways, and waterways. With this layering system, we can differentiate between new and existing or phased construction, as well as differentiate between different levels of surveyed data. We have over 180 different discipline designators. We have 201 major groups and 611 different minor groups. And we have 17 different status fields. You put them all together and the total possible combinations are staggering. And that is just the ones that we have identified. When you consider we allow some user-defined groups in the system, the possibilities become exponential. The Construction Specification Institute contributed the uniform drawing system with all of its many parts to the NCS. These parts, or modules, make up much of the remainder of the National CAD standard. Module 1, Drawing Set Organization, explains all the things necessary to organize your plan set. It goes through sheet content and order, file naming, and sheet identification requirements. This module guides you through all the steps necessary to name your model, sheets, and schedules using established discipline designators and modifiers. Anyone then reading your plan set will be able to easily navigate through the sheets to find what they're looking for. Where Module 1 leaves you with an understanding of how sheets are assembled and electronic files are put together, Module 2, Sheet Organization, then shows you how to assemble each sheet. It goes through all the parts of setting up a title block by dividing the printed sheet into different organization blocks. It explains the difference between the drawing area, the title block area, and the production data area. With consistent sheet organization and consistent drawing set organization, users will become more productive through repetitive work experiences. Module 3 outlines schedules and their purposes. It defines what makes up a schedule and then proceeds to establish rules for each part of the schedule: lines, headings, columns, rows. This is also the place where you'll find information on how to build legends, keys, and indexes to support your schedules. Examples of the most often used schedules are available as part of a standard in an Excel file format. Everything from Division 1 survey schedules, doors and windows schedules, electrical panel schedules, even Division 33 storm and drainage schedules are included. Should you have need to link in schedules from outside spreadsheets, this module also establishes naming conventions for reference library schedules. Module 4, Drafting Conventions. This is the catch-all for all those things you learned in drafting school: drawing orientation, north arrow location, grid system, drawing layout, drafting precision, scale of drawings. How about line width and line types? The differences between match lines, hidden lines. When should a line be bold? When should it be hidden? This is where you can find information on how to dimension. What is a dimension? What are the parts of a dimension line and dimension string? And how big should they be? Material identification, notations, cross-references. What are sheet types? Civil plans, landscape plans, architectural plans. All those pieces and parts that took months to learn and master in school are condensed into about 60 pages of guidelines to establish the look of your drawings. Anyone that has ever checked or did quality control work on drawing plans knows that when you deviate from a look from one section of your plans to another, your set will look like cut and paste job rather than a coordinated set, diminishing the overall quality of your work. By following a consistent standard, clients will be impressed with your team's results. Module 5, Terms and Abbreviations. We've assembled a master list of standard terms and abbreviations from leading industry standards and compiled them into one concise, searchable list. This module has also established when and when not to use abbreviations, as well as giving you a guide on when and how to abbreviate words and terms not shown in the master list. By the way, our master list takes up about 150 printed searchable pages. Module 6, Symbols. In our last ballot session, our symbols task team went all out and refined and redrew most of our symbols. We now have samples in DWG file format for over 1,200 symbols, hatch patterns, and line styles. They have all been categorized to make them easy to find. This module further establishes some guidelines for fonts needed to properly show the symbols and includes line styles for their use. They expanded on the 6-digit master format classification system to better support the current and future needs of the symbols module. Module 7, Notations. What goes into making a proper note in a drawing? What format should notes be in? This module discusses all types of notes, from general notes and sheet notes to reference keynotes, and how and where on the drawings they should be placed. Module 8, Code Conventions, discusses the identification of regulatory information. It is an overall view of the code to come from and the relevance of what should be included in the construction documents. There it is. Had a little problem switching slides. My apologies. Version 6 now includes the BIM implementation guide. I'm not going to go and walk through that part. I'm going to leave that for one of our other panelists to discuss with you today. It's a discussion unto itself. Plotting guidelines. This section goes over the different ways to plot drawings both in black and white and color. It discusses pen weights and assigns colors to numbers for those needing to create consistent color plots. Our appendices include sections on statements of conformance, what is optional and what is required in the NCS to conform to the standard. Also included in the appendices are the rules of governance, the consensus rules followed by all the NCS committees to review, debate, and approve suggested changes to the standard. And last but not least, our implementation guidelines. The last thing in the book is probably the first place you want to go when you start to implement the NCS in your firm. It outlines a step-by-step process starting with management approval and works its way through sample projects, building on implementing more and more of the NCS until you're fully implemented. That, in a nutshell, is the 30,000-foot view of the NCS, at least as I see it. At this point, Christine, I think it's time for our first poll question.
It sure is. Thank you, Ed. All right. Our first poll question today is, are you a current NCS user? If you will all just please take a moment to respond. Okay, thank you for your responses. All right. Our next speaker today discussing why you should use the NCS is Michael Fate. Michael is the BIM Department Director at TK1SC, an MEP consulting firm in Southern California. He has worked in various capacities in small local firms as well as large international firms. He is an advocate of standards and strongly believes that standardization is the key to consistency and efficiency in any organization. He has worked with the United States National CAD Standard since its inception. Michael serves as the Vice Chair of the NCS Project Committee and Steering Committee and was the NCS Steering Committee Liaison to the version 6 NCS Symbols Task Team. I will now turn the time over to Michael.
Thank you, Christine. So today I want to talk about why you should use the NCS. As I try to advance the slide here. Okay, so why should you use the NCS? I want to speak from my own experience and from two different perspectives. The two viewpoints are the individual viewpoint, the guy sitting behind the keyboard, banging on the keyboard, doing production, and the management perspective. The CAD manager who works in an organization and is trying to get everybody to be more efficient by using the same. So from the individual viewpoint, when the NCS is used by the project team, it really eliminates the time-consuming process of trying to figure out the meaning of the layers and symbols created by another person. I mean, we rarely work on projects where we are the only person creating the drawings. Sharing drawings among clients, consultants, sub-consultants, and co-workers is typical on projects. But even if all of those entities are using a consistent standard within their organization, most likely you will not be familiar with it because it is their own internal standard. That means that when you receive their drawings, you'll need to spend the time figuring out what their layers and symbols mean. If you look at the cartoon, the guy in the front who's the advocate of standards loves his own standards, and his are the best standards around. And he's espousing that to his co-worker there, essentially saying that these are the ones that we should use. Now, this is a very real scenario. In my firm, a multidisciplinary firm, these two guys might be in different disciplines. They might even be in the same discipline, working on the same project, but not using the same standards because each of their own is the best standard. That's the perspective that most people have. And a lot of them might be right that they have the best standard. The problem is that nobody's aware of that standard. Nobody has access to that standard, and nobody knows what it means. Only the guy that's using it really understands it. So let's be honest, not all firms have meaningful layer names. At a bare minimum, you need to know what the layer names mean so you can adjust the legibility appropriately to achieve the desired look on your drawings. If everyone was using the NCS and using it consistently, you would remove this wasteful task. So let's look at it from another perspective, the management viewpoint. Choosing the NCS eliminates the battle to agree on a single standard because it provides a neutral solution to the statement, my standards are better than yours. Organizations grow organically through internal promotion. They grow by hiring individuals from other companies, through mergers and acquisitions, or any combination thereof. All of these methods of growth bring with them biases based on individual experiences and comfort level with their legacy standards. Trying to come to a consensus on a standard is a formidable task that can easily be avoided by selecting a neutral standard, one that's currently used by over 6,000 public and private sector firms in the U.S. and abroad. And of course, I'm speaking about the NCS. So look at that cartoon. You see that everybody slugged it out, beat each other up, and they think they finally came to a consensus on a standard. I'm sure many of you have seen this cartoon before. I've lived this scenario in my professional experience through the firms that I've worked with. Now, it hasn't come to blows and it hasn't become physical, but I'll tell you what, there's been some pretty heated discussions regarding what standards everybody should use. And I found that one of the easiest things for me to do as someone coming in trying to get everybody to use the same standard is to use a neutral standard. And a standard that is accessible to everyone, not only within our organization, but outside of our organization. This has proved to be very effective for us in the firms that I've worked for by implementing the NCS and not taking sides or siding with any particular person or group. So in a utopian world, we would all be using the same standard. Once learned, that standard would become second nature. We wouldn't even have to think about it. Our projects would become more efficient. We would spend more of our time on the design than on the standards themselves, which is really what we should be doing. So let's move on to our next poll question. Christine, back to you.
Great, thank you, Michael. Our next poll question, have you ever used the NCS? Again, if you just please take a minute to respond to that. Okay, here are the results. Thank you so much for participating in that. Our next panel expert today is Johnny Fortune, and he will be discussing BIM within the NCS. Johnny is actively involved in standards development within several national committees for the United States National CAD Standard, the National BIM Standard United States, the National BIM Guidelines for Owners, and the United States Army Corps of Engineers Industry BIM Sim Consortium. Fortune serves as the chair of the Building Smart Alliance and is BIM director at Bullock Tice Associates in Pensacola, Florida, where he has led the complete transition from CAD to BIM, directs the company's overall BIM strategies, standards, technology operations, and oversees BIM integration with external stakeholders. He's presented CAD BIM workflow integration at several venues, including Autodesk University, NIBS Annual Conference, GeoBiz, CSI Chapter meetings, Society of American Military Engineer, and other events. I will now turn the time over to Johnny.
Thank you, Christine. So as Ed suggested earlier, well, I'll be talking about BIM within the NCS, specifically version number 6. It was an entirely new module that was added to the National CAD Standard. And so I'd like to start by just looking at the 3 most common questions that we get once we came up with the idea to implement this section. We've had to answer these same questions throughout the process. And so the first question is, well, why does the NCS contain information about BIM? The second question is, how does NCS content, current content, apply to a BIM implementation section? And what actually is some of that that's in the NCS BIM implementation section? So we'll start with question number 1 and answer the why. And so basically we realize that, well, the world we live in, the industry as it is today, that our project contracts and our deliverables remain a very sheet-centric delivery system, and they require graphical output. And that output does need to be compliant with a standard, and there's no better one to comply with in graphical output than the National CAD Standard, so everybody understands and knows what they're looking at. We also understood that the processes that are in place and many requirements from owners and clients would require us to be compliant with the NCS regardless of what software application we're using to provide the design. We also recognized there was a void amongst the National CAD Standards and the National BIM Standards for practical BIM workflow. Well, that void is there because NBIMS doesn't necessarily address a graphical standard, and as many of you know, NCS was not written for BIM, so we need to provide some kind of clarification. We also acknowledge that NCS contains a lot of information that's still used in a BIM environment. So we found it was important to discuss BIM in the National CAD Standards version 6. And so how does it relate to it? Well, primarily it relates in terms of graphical output. So if we could think beyond just a CAD or just a BIM standard and think about a graphical standard, a lot of the content within the National CAD Standards applies to that graphical output. So anything that has to do with how a sheet is set up, the order of the sheet in the set, dimensions, callouts, line styles, line types, schedules, many of the things that have been already mentioned, those things are all applicable if you're working in on a BIM platform or a CAD platform. So that's how it applies. So now we'd like to get into a little bit more of the details about, well what actually applies. I've provided a brief overview of the main sections of the NCS that Ed had discussed previously in the webinar. Implementation is a brand new section, and it contains 4 basic subsections of introduction, references, clarifications, and basic BIM guidelines. So if we look at those and break them down just a little bit to give you an example, and obviously time would not permit us today to give you all the content that's in this section, but we did want to give you a sample. Our introduction really does try to set the tone for what we were trying to accomplish with this section, and that is that we were not trying to displace a CAD workflow. Many will continue to work in CAD for years to come, but we also needed to help bridge the gap for BIM workflow. So once we introduced the section and then we began to point to some references, we acknowledged the fact that, and many would question, well, what about the National BIM standard? How does it relate? Well, the National BIM standard, actually version 2 and version 3, actually reference the National CAD standard because it is an understood, given that all of the output that comes out of any particular BIM software should be National CAD standards compliant. So then we got into the meat of, well, we need to provide some clarifications for this content because we had to approach it in a way to, again, not upset a CAD workflow, but a way that would provide clarifications because there were some challenges between the 2 different technologies. So there's some content within the NCS that we didn't need to provide any clarification at all. For example, how a sheet set is organized. It really doesn't matter whether you're using CAD or BIM. The NCS well defines it, and you can be compliant with the NCS regardless of the platform. Symbols was a different category that we realized, well, maybe not all of the elements, the FF&E elements within a facility, it may not need to be symbolized down to just a 2D representation of it. Maybe for some BIM platforms, the 3-dimensional representation of it worked well, and so we tried to make some provisions to not have to constrain a BIM workflow to the point where it made it less intuitive. So in addition to the clarifications, we broke down the NCS even by section. Here's just a couple of examples, but we broke down the NCS by section and talked about the areas that you could comply and the areas that were a little bit more difficult to comply, how the exceptions applied so that they could still have an efficient and intuitive workflow. Additionally, we didn't want to just leave people without some basic guidelines. So we provided two basic categories. One had to do with authoring content. And so we talk about some of the very well-known best practices in a BIM workflow. And in addition to that, we discuss when we're delivering a model or we're trying to coordinate amongst multiple models, we provided some guidance on some guidelines that should be used. Summarily, we realized that this is not going to be an exhaustive BIM section within the NCS. There's many other standards that people may reference, and if you look at the National BIM standard alone, there are many other standards and references that are included there. So we understood that for a project to be successful and also to be compliant with national standards, it was going to take a holistic approach of utilizing not only a national BIM standard, but also the national CAD standard. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Christine for our next poll question. Thank you, Christine.
Great. Thank you, Johnny. And our third poll question today is, if you are not a current NCS user, would you consider purchasing the NCS? If you'd please take just a moment to respond. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We are now going to be moving into the next portion of our presentation, which is the question and answer portion. Joining our panel are 3 additional members of the committee. And first up will be Stephen Spangler. Stephen graduated from Virginia Tech with a mechanical engineering degree. He worked for Naval Facilities Engineering Command for 2 years. Then in 1992, went to work at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers CAD BIM Technology Center in Vicksburg, Mississippi. He has been involved with the United States National CAD Standard since version 1, serving on both the NCS Steering Committee and various other committees. Stephen is also the author of the United States Army Corps of Engineers AEC CAD Standard and AEC Graphic Standard documents, both of which are based on the NCS, but add additional Department of Defense requirements. Next up is Jennifer Dibona. Jennifer is a longtime CAD consultant and trainer doing business as That CAD Girl. She is based in Raleigh, North Carolina. That CAD Girl provides sales, support, and training for Carlson Software, AutoCAD, and IntelliCAD software programs, as well as Carlson hardware and data collection. They specialize in field-to-finish, surface modeling, and all aspects of CAD standardization. Jennifer joined the United States National CAD Standard Project Committee in 2010. She served as the chair of the version 6 NCS Survey Civil Ad Hoc Task Team and is a member of the Project Committee and Steering Committee. Last is Jason Stern-Iolo. And Jason is an associate with RRMM Architects and the firm's BIM CAD manager. Jason has been with the firm since 2006, during which time he has been responsible for the development and maintenance of RRMM's BIM CAD standards. He is also an Autodesk certified instructor for Revit and is a Revit certified professional who has been responsible for both implementing Revit and training RRMM staff. Jason also serves as a member of the United States National CAD Standard Project Committee and Steering Committee, and is a member of the National BIM Standard United States Project Committee. To moderate the Q&A will be Dominique Fernandez, a director at the National Institute of Building Sciences. I will now turn the time over to Dominique.
Thank you, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone. So we have our first question for Jennifer Dibona, and it's in regards to survey layers. Are there plans to incorporate 3D point cloud data into survey layers?
Thanks for that. Yep, thanks for that, Dominique. I am not sure. We are working, I think we have a Get Involved section at the end of slide at the end of this that's going to prompt for volunteers for the next revision. So we haven't actually decided that yet, but encourage everybody to get involved if that's a need. That's the first time I've actually heard that question, I think.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our next question is for Stephen Spangler. The question is, what were some of the major changes to the layer sections between version 5 and version 6?
All right. As far as major changes, the look of the layers and the format of them did not change. You still have the 1-character discipline designator followed by the 4-character major group, and then followed subsequently by 4-character minor groups. So the format did not change. As far as what changed in version 6, there were new major groups added to cover things such as airfield items, things like major groups to cover an airspace or an apron or a taxiway or a helipad. And also there were major groups added to cover if you're doing a building according to LEED. For instance, a major group was added to cover gray water items if you had a gray water piping system in your building. So there weren't really any format changes, but there were some new major groups added. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you, Stephen. My next question is for Jason Stern-Iolo. Does the standard cover specific symbols or notation that can be used by each system equipment, such as speakers, etc.?
Thank you, Dominique. Yes, there's over 1,300 symbols in the NCS currently. There are 72 added for the version 6 that covered a lot of communication items like speakers and speaker wire. We also updated all of those symbols to match the master format system and added some clarifications for the discipline, the type, if it's an object or a text or something like that. But yes, there are symbols that cover those. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I have a question here for Ed Lowe. How is the NCS adapting to accommodate or encompass Revit and other BIM-related software?
Thanks, Dominique. Well, we've been trying very hard to stay vendor neutral in most cases. We realize sometimes that it looks like we're leaning to one or the other vendor formats, etc., but we try and stay neutral. Our symbols task team, for example, created all the example symbols in DWG format because that was a common denominator or common software they all had. And the original symbols were done somewhere in 1999 in that format. And it was easier just to modify them and keep going. Other than that, like I said, we tried to stay vendor neutral, and I think that's it. Thanks, Dominique.
Thank you, Ed. So this question is for Johnny Fortune. How do you see BIM impacting the use of layers?
Well, thank you, Dominique. Well, as Ed just suggested, we've tried to stay software vendor neutral, and to that point, some BIM platforms are still layer centric, and then we know that some are not. Some are object or category centric. And so for the BIM implementation section, this is something that we spent a fair amount of time discussing amongst our task team, and then developed what we thought was the best path forward. And that was that if the software application had layers, layers were native to that software application, then during the design authoring as well as the export, that it should still be compliant with the layering system as denoted in the NCS. But for BIM software applications that are not layer centric, that are object or categorically centric, that the underlying layer system may not be evident to the user, and therefore they may not necessarily be able to control that. But at the very least, if they export those BIM models out into a DWG format or other CAD format, then it should comply with the layering system. And I think we reached a consensus that most of the software applications out there, even if they weren't layer centric, had the ability to export to a compliant layer list. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you, Johnny. So I have another survey civil question, and this is for Jennifer. The comment is, the people I work with tell me that the NCS is primarily for architects, and there is nothing in it for civil engineers or surveyors. Do you think this is true?
Hi, Dominique. Thanks for that question. It's actually one that I get a lot, and I think we have to say that just the existence of the Survey Civil Task Team is an admission that the NCS hasn't been as friendly as it could have been to land surveyors, engineers, even contractors. But we're making some progress here. In the last revision cycle, the task team got 51 of our recommendations approved. Some of the revisions that we got into V6 include adding a bunch of layer components, major and minor groups, for things like airfields, ALTA, traffic control, survey and mapping, boundaries. We also added several drawing and sheet types for plans and profiles, road cross sections, and we also added some engineering scales such as 1 inch equals 100 feet instead of having all architectural based scales like 1/4 inch equals a foot. When the task team did our first complete review, one thing we all noticed and that bugged us somewhat was that the word building was used throughout the standard, even when we were talking about or when it referred to site-related projects. So wherever it made sense, we got a little bit nitpicky, and we submitted revisions to change the word building to model or something that seemed a little more appropriate for all disciplines. Along those same lines, there were a lot of examples or sample images that referred to only to buildings or floor plans. So we were also able to get several of those images and examples updated to show maybe buildings and parking lots, or to use other examples that surveyors and engineers would work with every day. I noticed there were a couple other questions that had come in a bit late, so I wanted to try to address a couple of those. But at the same time, I want to make a bit of an appeal to the surveyors and engineers listening. Just don't be intimidated by the thought of using the NCS. You know, our industry, the land development professionals, we're a late adopter to the NCS, and it's still pretty new for us. But it is a good thing. You know, I think you've got your implementation guidelines, but I think using the layer standard is a good place to start. I am and have been a fan of the layer standard. I think it's very comprehensive, it's customizable, it's also scalable. The reason I say it's both comprehensive and customizable is because you can mix and match your own major and minor groups to create a layer that's going to make sense for pretty much any feature that you need to show in your plans. So I like that. But it's also scalable. You can make your layers be as broad or as narrow as you need to. So as an example, an engineer may use the major group road with minor groups to show all the details of a road, such as the edge of pavement, back of curb, gutter lines, asphalt areas, and have them all on separate layers, different colors, different line types. But an architect can use that same major group road, but just throw all those road details onto one layer, because it's not the focus of the architect's design. They don't need 10 layers where one's going to do. And then vice versa. When engineers and surveyors get an architect's drawing with all their layers, we can use the major group building, BLDG, to put most or all of those features on one layer, because that's all we need. And then lastly, to answer one of the other late questions, I think we do need to acknowledge that we are, you know, we're vendor neutral, but we are getting more and more buy-in to the NCS from the different software manufacturers. Carlson Software, which is what I use, and Civil 3D, both, they now come installed with the drawing templates that have pre-made layers, line types, symbols, all based on the National CAD standard. Anybody can use those templates, save them, give them your company name, make them your own, and it does make that implementation process a whole lot easier. So hopefully that's answered most of those questions, and thanks, Dominique. Back to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very comprehensive response. I have a question here for our government representative on the steering committee. So I'm going to point this question to Steve Spangler. Could you address how the standard is implemented nationally in the private sector, but most importantly in the government sector?
Okay, that's a very good question. The key thing when you're implementing any standard is you need to have buy-in from as high a level in your organization as possible. And I'm speaking for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We've been lucky in that our headquarters level people recognize the need for a standard that's implemented throughout the organization, and as such have put out mandates that say basically thou shalt follow the AEC CAD standard, which is based on the national CAD standard. And we also put that in our contract language out to contractors, that you should follow the national CAD standard, the AEC CAD standard. So I would say whether you're in a small organization or a large organization, the best thing you need to do is get buy-in from the top down and make sure that there's some document that you can point to that your higher-ups have said you need to follow the National CAD standard or whatever standard you're implementing. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you, Steve. A question for Jason. Has any work been done with the software vendors to incorporate the NCS into their software and achieve easier compliance?
Thank you. Yeah, we have and continue to reach out to the software vendors for them to include some of the symbology that the National CAD Standards has into their software already. Also, being part of some of the task teams on the NCS, we have started creating templates and symbols in other formats other than the DWG format that traditionally comes with the NCS. It's quite a big task to do all those and get them into all the different varieties out there, but we have started that process. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Jason. I have a very pointed question, and I will direct this one to Ed Lowe. And it concerns letter designation. And the question is, what is the letter designation for ceiling sheet in architectural drawing? Is AC acceptable?
Well, interesting question. No, I would not use AC for ceilings, ceiling plans. I would use something just in the architectural section and go with like an A-100 series for a plan. And for us, we keep the general plans in the lower numbers, so the 101, 102, and then we just pick an arbitrary number like 150, 151, 152, and start our ceiling plans there. We try and keep if you have, for us, it would be like 101. So if the first floor would be the number 1, then our ceiling plan would match that as 151, that kind of thing. But there's no second level designator for ceiling plans at this time. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you, Ed. So we have a question for all panelists, but I'm going to direct this question to Johnny. Given your expertise, do you have an approximate guideline as to how much time it would take to migrate from a CAD platform to a BIM platform?
Well, thank you, Dominique. I think that would really depend on the size of the firm. Obviously, the larger the firm, the more disciplines involved would be more difficult. The age of the firm would come into play. How much of an existing library do you have that you'd have to modify it? So, I hate to give the answer, it depends, but it really does. It really does depend on the firm and the culture of the firm. I can just only speak from my personal experience and say that when we transitioned from a CAD to BIM workflow and from CAD libraries to BIM libraries and content, we really did it one project at a time. We did it with a really small team, such as a beta testing team, and we did a pilot project, and then from that pilot project we then began to utilize those new standards. So it depends on the size of the team, the culture of the firm. I would highly recommend that the key part is having a champion for that, someone who can devote some time to it and be committed to it, and then have the support of senior management that's going to give them the backing to complete that process. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Johnny. So I'm going to go through some of the questions that I see online. AEC standard has specific layer names, while the NECS has a lot of user input leeway in naming. Do you have an idea on how to address? So that would be for Stephen.
Well, I'm not sure this will answer it correctly, but yes, there are some cases where we had to create major groups and minor groups that are not in the National CAD standard simply because we, with the Corps of Engineers, address items in our drawings that were not covered by the National CAD standard, things like locks and dams. So in those cases, we had to come up with something because there wasn't anything in the National CAD standard. But in the cases where we have come up with layers or symbols or whatever that we felt other agencies or architectural firms would benefit from, we have definitely provided those or submitted those during the revision cycles so we can get those into the National CAD standard and possibly other organizations can benefit from them. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you, Stephen. One question for Johnny. Is there any discussion around establishing a standard towards the information side of BIM, such as Rivet shared parameters?
Excellent question. The task team, when developing the BIM implementation section, we looked at that. We realized that there was a need for it. During the revision cycle, we simply were not afforded the additional time to write a standard for that. I think in future versions, whether it be in the NCS or the National BIM standard, it certainly should be addressed. View naming, parameter naming, having a convention for that. Obviously, currently not is in the NCS and is not in National BIM standard, but I think it's an industry need. And to echo something Jennifer said earlier, you know, I would encourage people to get involved, because the more people who are involved in trying to build and facilitate the consensus process, the more usable content there will be. We recognize it as a need. We need more people involved to help us define that. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you, Johnny. And so we're at 5 minutes from the end of the hour. So I'm going to direct this last question to Ed. And it is, how does the NCS address line weight differences between out-of-the-box BIM software and what the CAD standard specifies?
Save the hard one for me. I thought we were friends, Dominique. Let's see. Read that one again.
How does the NCS address line weight differences between out-of-the-box BIM software and what the standard specifies?
Well, the standard's right. I mean, what other answer is there? I mean, out of the box for any given software is not going to match out of the box for another piece of software. So any standard you use, no matter what it is going to be different. So every software that I've used so far has always allowed me to change the line weights, the line styles, etc., to conform to what my firm wanted to see, which in this case is the National CAD standard. So I hope that answers it. It sounds wishy-washy, but did I miss the point? Anybody else on the call, did I miss the point of this question? Or
I tend to agree with you, Ed. This is Johnny. I would just suggest that, you know, the NCS is certainly asking the software vendors to make their software compliant with the NCS, and that is also a customer-driven topic. So the more customers that say to their software vendors, we need this to work for us out of the box and be compliant because we have project contractual requirements to be compliant, I think the more people that say that, the more it would encourage software vendors to just double check and ensure that their system is compliant. But I believe you're right on, Ed. We're not trying to modify the NCS for one particular application or another. We're trying to you know, utilize the consensus process as we've done for years, to gauge what the industry says is the standard, publish that in the NCS, and then we're asking the software vendors to modify their software to be compliant.
Thank you both. So this will conclude our Q&A, and with that, I will turn it over back to you, Christine.
Great, thank you, Dominique. And another thank you to our panelists for their time and effort today. Please note any questions that were not addressed will be addressed with follow-up one-on-one communications. In addition, please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists with any additional questions you may have in regards to the NCS. If you would like to get involved, as been mentioned on this presentation with the NCS, we invite you to participate. Membership is open to all owners of the NCS. To get involved, go to the NCS website and click on Get Involved. Again, thank you to our panelists and to you, the participants, for your support of the NCS. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. We appreciate your feedback, and again, thank you and have a great day.